The silence that followed Stone's words felt heavier than the storm outside. Emma's classmates continued their chatter about crystal chandeliers and oil paintings, oblivious to the earthquake happening in her chest. Mrs. Patterson, their teacher, was explaining the mansion's history to a cluster of parents near the grand piano, her voice a distant hum. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached toward the photograph, then stopped mid-air. The woman in the picture looked exactly like her mother, the same dark eyes, the same gentle smile that haunted Emma's dreams. But this version wore an elaborate white gown with delicate lace sleeves, nothing like the simple blue dress in the wedding photo her father kept. "I don't understand," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. Stone stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the fireplace. Up close, she could see the intricate details of his tattoos. A rose wrapped in chains on his forearm, a pair of angel wings across his knuckles. Despite his intimidating appearance, his movements were careful, measured, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "What was her name, little one?" His voice was surprisingly gentle. "Isabella Rodriguez." The words tumbled out before Emma could stop them. "But she died when I was 3. Car accident on Highway 101. Something flickered across Stone's face. Pain, anger, recognition. He glanced around the room, checking to see if anyone was listening, then knelt down to Emma's eye level. This close, she could smell leather and motor oil, rain, and something that reminded her of her father's cologne. "Isabella Maria Santos," he said quietly, watching her face. She had a scar on her left shoulder from falling off her bike when she was 7. She hummed La Llorona when she cooked, and she had nightmares about white pickup trucks. Emma's knees went weak. The scar, her father had mentioned it once. The humming, she'd always wondered why that particular melody felt so familiar, why it made her chest ache with longing she couldn't explain. "How do you know that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Stone's gray eyes darkened. "Because I loved her. Because she was supposed to marry me, not—" He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching. "Not my dad," Emma finished, the pieces clicking together in her mind like broken glass. "Emma? There you are!" Mrs. Patterson's cheerful voice cut through the tension. The teacher approached with her usual bright smile, clipboard clutched against her chest. "We're moving to the library next. Don't wander off from the group, sweetheart." Emma nodded mutely, but didn't move. She couldn't leave, not now. Not when everything she thought she knew about her life was crumbling around her, like the leaves outside in the storm. Stone rose to his full height, his expression shifting back to the controlled mask of a man accustomed to hiding his emotions. But his eyes never left Emma's face. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Would it be possible for the young lady to stay here a moment longer? I believe she's interested in the history of this particular photograph." The teacher beamed, clearly pleased by the wealthy donor's interest in one of her students. "Of course, Mr. Callahan. Emma's always been fascinated by local history. Emma, you can catch up with us in the library in a few minutes." As Mrs. Patterson's footsteps faded down the hallway, Stone and Emma stood alone beside the fireplace. The storm outside seemed to intensify, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. "Why do you have her picture?" Emma asked, surprised by her own boldness. Stone was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. "Because some people are worth remembering, even when the world tries to make you forget them." He turned to face her fully. "Tell me about your father, Emma. What does he do?" "He's a librarian," she said automatically. "At the Sausalito branch. He's worked there since before I was born." A librarian. Something about the way Stone said it suggested he found this either amusing or suspicious. "And he never talks about your mother?" Emma shook her head. "He says it's too painful. That she was perfect, and that's all I need to know." "Perfect." Stone's laugh held no humor. "Your mother was many things, little one, but perfect wasn't one of them. She was brave, fierce, beautiful, and more stubborn than a California wildfire. But she was also terrified, so terrified that she was willing to break both our hearts to keep you safe." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Keep me safe from what? Stone's expression hardened, and for a moment she glimpsed the dangerous man beneath the careful facade. That, little Rodriguez, is exactly the right question. But I'm not sure you're ready for the answer. Before Emma could respond, the sound of her classmates' laughter drifted from the library, reminding her that somewhere beyond this mansion, her normal life was waiting. But normal felt like a foreign concept now, as distant as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds. The laughter from the library pulled Emma back like a lifeline to a world that suddenly felt fragile and precious. She looked toward the doorway where golden light spilled into the hallway, illuminating the path back to everything familiar. Back to being just Emma Rodriguez, seventh grader at Bayview Middle School, daughter of David the librarian. A girl whose biggest worry yesterday had been whether Jake Martinez would notice her new haircut. "I have to go," she whispered, though her feet remained planted beside the fireplace. Stone nodded slowly. "Yes, you do. For now." The weight of those last two words followed her as she hurried down the marble hallway, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. She found her class gathered around an ornate mahogany desk where Mrs. Patterson was explaining how the mansion's original owner had been a railroad baron in the 1890s. Emma slipped into the back of the group, trying to blend in, but everything felt different now. Her classmates' excited chatter seemed to come from very far away. "Emma, you okay?" whispered her best friend Sarah Chen, appearing at her elbow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Emma thought, but forced a smile instead. "Just tired. This place is kind of overwhelming." Sarah grinned. "Tell me about it. Can you imagine living somewhere like this? I'd get lost just trying to find the bathroom." She paused, studying Emma's face more carefully. "Are you sure you're okay? You're really pale." Before Emma could answer, Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. "All right, everyone, time to head back to the bus. Remember, your reflection essays on tonight's tour are due Friday." The walk back through the mansion felt like sleepwalking. Emma's eyes searched for Stone, but he was nowhere to be seen. The photograph of her mother, or the woman who looked exactly like her mother, remained on the mantelpiece, watching them pass with that familiar, gentle smile that now felt like a lie. Outside, the storm had intensified. Rain drummed against the bus windows as they wound down the narrow hillside roads toward town. Emma pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the mansion's lights disappear behind them. Beside her, Sarah chattered about the chandelier in the dining room and speculated about what it would be like to have servants. Emma nodded at appropriate moments, but her mind was spinning with fragments of Stone's words. She was terrified, so terrified that she was willing to break both our hearts to keep you safe. Safe from what? And if her mother had been so afraid, why had her father never mentioned it? In 12 years, he'd painted Isabella Rodriguez as a saint, a beloved wife taken too soon by a tragic accident. There had never been hints of danger, never suggestions of secrets or hidden pasts. Just gentle sadness and the persistent refrain that some memories were too painful to share. The bus pulled up to the school, just as the evening's first parent cars began arriving for pickup. Emma spotted her father's familiar gray Honda Civic idling under the streetlight windshield wipers working steadily against the rain. Through the driver's window, she could see his profile, the wire-rimmed glasses he'd worn for as long as she could remember, the cardigan sweater that made him look exactly like what he was, a quiet, bookish man who spent his days organizing stories other people had written. "See you tomorrow," Sarah called, jogging toward her mother's SUV. "Don't forget we're supposed to work on our science project after school." Emma waved goodbye and climbed into the Honda, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and the vanilla air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror. Her father smiled at her in the reflection, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when he was genuinely happy to see her. "How was the mansion tour, kiddo? Learn anything interesting about how the other half lives?" "It was fine," Emma said automatically, then found herself studying his face in the mirror. Had he always looked so tired? Were those new lines around his eyes? "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He pulled away from the school, navigating carefully through the rain-slicked streets. "Do you ever wish things were different? Like, that we had more money, or lived somewhere fancier?" David Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he brought to helping library patrons find exactly the right book. You know what I wish for, Emma? I wish for exactly what we have. Quiet evenings, good books, and the most remarkable daughter a father could ask for. He met her eyes in the rearview mirror again. Why? Did the tour make you feel like we're missing something? The genuine concern in his voice made Emma's chest tighten. This was her father, the man who had raised her alone, who had never missed a parent-teacher conference or school play, who still read her bedtime stories even though she was probably too old for them. Whatever secrets he might be keeping, whatever lies he might have told about her mother, she could see the love in his eyes as clearly as her own reflection. "No," she said softly. "I was just wondering." But as they drove through the familiar streets toward home, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that everything she treasured about their quiet life together might be built on foundations far more fragile than she'd ever imagined. The next 3 days passed in a blur of forced normalcy that felt like performing in a play where Emma had forgotten all her lines. She went through the motions, attending classes, working on her science project with Sarah, helping her father organize returned books at the library after school, but Stone's words echoed in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. She was terrified, so terrified that she was willing to break both our hearts to keep you safe. Thursday evening found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, supposedly working on her reflection essay about the mansion tour, but the blank page mocked her. How could she write about crystal chandeliers and marble staircases when all she could think about was that photograph? She'd started the essay a dozen times, each attempt more stilted than the last. "Writer's block?" her father asked, appearing beside her with a mug of hot chocolate topped with the miniature marshmallows he still bought, even though she'd outgrown them years ago. Emma stared at the steam rising from the mug and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Dad, what was Mom's favorite song?" The question hung in the air between them. David Rodriguez went very still, his hand frozen halfway to adjusting his glasses, a nervous habit Emma had never paid attention to before this week. "Her favorite song," he repeated slowly. That's a very specific question, kiddo. You always say she loved music. I just wondered if there was something special she used to sing." Emma kept her voice casual, but her heart was pounding. "Maybe something in Spanish?" Something flickered across her father's face, so quickly she might have imagined it. She used to hum sometimes, while cooking, but I can't remember the melody anymore." "It's been so long, Emma." The lie sat between them like a physical presence. Emma had heard her father humming La Llorona just last month while making pancakes on a Sunday morning. She'd even commented on how pretty and sad it sounded, and he'd simply smiled and said it was something he'd picked up somewhere. "I wish I could remember her better," Emma said, watching his face carefully. "Sometimes I think I hear things or smell something that reminds me of her, but I can never quite grab hold of the memory." "You were very young when she died." David's voice carried the same gentle finality it always did when discussions of Isabella Rodriguez reached their natural limit. "But you have her eyes. And her stubborn streak. What about her family, her parents or siblings? Don't I have grandparents somewhere?" This time, the pause was so long Emma wondered if her father had heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Your mother's family. They weren't in her life anymore. Sometimes people make choices that separate them from the ones they love. She never talked much about her past." Another lie, Emma realized with startling clarity. Or at least, not the whole truth. The careful way he chose his words, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. It was like watching someone navigate around hidden obstacles in a familiar room. The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet kitchen. David moved to answer it with obvious relief, but Emma's attention sharpened when she heard him say, "Rodriguez residence," in a voice that carried a tension she'd never noticed before. "No, I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," he said after a moment. "No one by that name lives here." But Emma had caught the name the caller had asked for, and it sent ice through her veins. Isabella Santos. Her father hung up and returned to the table, But his movements were different now. Careful, alert, like a deer that had caught an unfamiliar scent. "Wrong number?" Emma asked, testing. "Telemarketer," he said dismissively. "They never get names right." The third, lie in as many minutes. Emma felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. Her father, her honest, straightforward librarian father who had taught her that truth was the foundation of everything worthwhile, was lying to her. Not just omitting difficult details or softening harsh realities, but actively, deliberately lying. "I'm going to finish my homework upstairs," she said, closing her laptop and gathering her papers. "Emma." His voice stopped her at the kitchen doorway. When she turned, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know I love you, right? More than anything in this world?" "I know, Dad." "And you know you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you?" The irony was so sharp it took her breath away. "I know." But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Emma made a decision that would have terrified her a week ago. Tomorrow, she would find a way to contact Stone Callahan, because whatever secrets her father was keeping, whatever truths he thought were too dangerous or painful to share, she was tired of living in a house built on lies. She needed to know who her mother really was, even if the answer destroyed everything she thought she knew about home. Emma sat on her bed staring at her laptop screen, cursor blinking mockingly in the Google search bar. For the past hour, she'd typed and deleted the same words over and over. "Marcus Stone Callahan, Hells Angels, Marin County." Her finger hovered over the enter key like it was the trigger of a loaded gun. What if he's dangerous? The thought had been circling her mind since she'd climbed the stairs with such fierce determination. In the safety of her bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals she was too old for but couldn't, yet bear to pack away, Stone's intimidating presence felt more real and terrifying. She remembered the tattoos covering his arms, the way other adults had given him respectful distance, the barely contained power in his careful movements. What if Dad finds out? That fear cut deeper than any worry about Stone himself. Her father checked her browser history sometimes, not in a sneaky way, but openly, the same way he checked her homework or asked about her day. It was part of his careful, protective love, the way he'd kept her safe and sheltered for 12 years. If he discovered she'd been researching the man from the mansion, the man who claimed to have loved her mother, Emma deleted the search terms again and closed the laptop. She pulled her knees to her chest and stared out her bedroom window at the quiet street below. Mrs. Chen was walking her golden retriever under the streetlights, the same route they took every evening at 9 o'clock. Mr. Patterson was bringing in his garbage cans, moving with the unhurried precision of someone following a routine established over decades. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Safe, predictable, boring in the most comforting way possible. What if everything I know about my life is a lie? The question made her stomach clench. If Stone was telling the truth, if her mother had been someone other than the gentle saint her father described, then what else might be fiction? How many of her father's bedtime stories about Isabella Rodriguez were carefully constructed fairy tales designed to keep a little girl from asking the wrong questions? She thought about the phone call downstairs, the way her father's whole body had changed when the caller asked for Isabella Santos. Not Rodriguez, Santos, like Stone had said. The coincidence felt too enormous to ignore, but acknowledging it meant accepting that her father had been lying to her face for as long as she could remember. Emma opened her laptop again, then immediately closed it. The cycle repeated 3 more times before she finally threw herself backward onto her pillow with a frustrated groan. What if I'm wrong? That possibility was almost worse than the alternatives. What if she was building mysteries out of coincidences, seeing deception in her father's natural grief? What if Stone Callahan was exactly what he appeared to be, a dangerous man who collected information about local families for reasons that had nothing to do with love or protection? The thought of confronting him again made her mouth go dry. She'd been brave in his mansion, or at least too shocked to be properly afraid. But now, in the quiet darkness of her room, she could imagine a dozen scenarios where seeking him out would be the stupidest, most dangerous decision of her 12-year-old life. What if he's lying? What if Dad's protecting me from something terrible? That question cut to the heart of her paralysis. Her father wasn't perfect. He burned pancakes, forgot to replace the batteries in smoke detectors, and had never successfully figured out how to fold a fitted sheet. But he was good. She'd never doubted that fundamental truth about him. If he was keeping secrets, if he was lying about her mother's past, it had to be for reasons he believed were important. Maybe her mother had been involved with dangerous people. Maybe there were threats her father was still protecting her from, even 9 years after Isabella's death. Maybe the truth really was too dangerous for a 12-year-old girl living in quiet Sausalito, where the biggest crime in recent memory had been someone stealing packages from the Hendersons' front porch. Emma reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Sarah's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Sarah would listen. Sarah would help her figure out what to do, would talk through the possibilities with a logical precision that made her such a good science partner. But telling Sarah would make it real in a way that felt irreversible. Once she spoke Stone's claims out loud, once she shared her growing certainty that her father was lying about fundamental aspects of her mother's identity, there would be no taking it back, no pretending she was just imagining things, no retreating into the comfortable fiction that her life was exactly what it seemed. She put the phone down without making the call. Tomorrow was Friday. She could survive one more day of pretending everything was normal, one more day of looking for clues in her father's careful words and watching for signs that their quiet life was built on foundations more fragile than she'd ever imagined. After tomorrow, she would decide what came next. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline October sunlight that made Emma's bedroom feel like a snow globe, beautiful, contained, and utterly separate from the real world. She lay in bed listening to her father's familiar morning routine downstairs, the whistle of the kettle, the soft scrape of a chair being pulled out from the kitchen table, the rustle of newspaper pages turning. The sounds that had anchored every morning of her life suddenly felt like a performance staged for her benefit. After today, she had promised herself, after today, I'll decide. But somewhere between brushing her teeth and braiding her hair, Emma realized the decision had already been made. She couldn't unknow what she knew. She couldn't unfeel the electric shock of recognition when she'd seen that photograph. She couldn't unhear the way her father's voice had changed when the caller asked for Isabella Santos. At breakfast, she watched her father butter his toast with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. 3 even strokes, edges to center, no crust left uncovered. He looked so ordinary in the morning light, so completely like himself, that for a moment, Emma wondered if she was losing her mind. This was David Rodriguez, who still cut her sandwiches into triangles because she'd preferred them that way as a 6-year-old, who kept a photo of her mother on his nightstand and sometimes touched the frame when he thought Emma wasn't looking, who had never, in 12 years, given her any reason to doubt his fundamental goodness. "Big science test today?" he asked, glancing up from the local news section. "Project presentation." The words felt thick in her mouth. "Sarah and I are doing ocean acidification." Ah, the environmental impacts of carbon absorption. Heavy topic for middle school. His easy knowledge of her schoolwork, the way he always knew exactly what she was studying, always asked the right follow-up questions, made her chest ache. If she was wrong about this, if she was about to destroy their relationship over paranoid fantasies and coincidences, "Dad?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "Mm-hmm." He looked up expectantly, and the genuine warmth in his brown eyes almost shattered her resolve. "Nothing. Just have a good day at the library." Something flickered across his face. Disappointment, maybe, or concern. "You too, kiddo. Make me proud." At school, Emma moved through her classes like a sleepwalker. During English, while Mrs. Davidson discussed metaphors and poetry, Emma found herself analyzing every conversation she'd ever had with her father, searching for hidden meanings. In history, as they learned about the witness protection program established in the 1960s, her heart hammered so loudly she was certain her classmates could hear it. "Earth to Emma," Sarah whispered during lunch, waving a hand in front of her face. "You're doing that weird staring thing again?" "Sorry. Just nervous about the presentation." "Since when are you nervous about presentations? You love getting up in front of people." Sarah studied her with the intense focus she usually reserved for lab experiments. "Okay, what's going on? And don't say nothing because you've been acting strange all week." Emma opened her mouth to deflect with another lie, then stopped. The easy deception felt too much like her father's careful evasions, too much like the web of half-truths she was beginning to see wrapped around her entire life. "Sarah," she said slowly, "what would you do if you found out your whole family history was fake?" Fake how? Like, adopted and nobody told you? More like, what if someone you trusted completely had been lying to you about something really important? Something that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Sarah set down her sandwich, giving the question the serious consideration Emma had known she would. "I guess I'd want to know the truth, even if it was scary or complicated." She paused. "But I'd also want to understand why they lied. Because if it was someone I trusted, there would have to be a reason, right? What if the reason was to protect you, but you were tired of being protected? Then I'd probably do something stupid and dangerous to find out anyway." Sarah's grin was rueful. "Why? Did you discover you're secretly a princess or something?" "Something like that." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. During their science presentation, Emma heard herself explaining carbon dioxide absorption rates and pH level changes, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing conversations she might have with Stone Callahan, imagining explanations for the photograph, preparing for truths that might reshape everything she understood about her identity. When the final bell rang, Emma made her choice. Instead of boarding the bus home, she slipped out the side entrance and walked to the public library downtown. Her father would be working until 6. She had 3 hours. At the computer terminal in the back corner, she typed the words she'd been afraid to search from home: Marcus Stone Callahan. The results filled her screen: news articles, police reports, motorcycle club databases. Her hands shook as she clicked the first link. There was no going back now. She was crossing into territory her father had spent 12 years protecting her from, stepping outside the safe boundaries of the life he'd built for them. But she had to know who her mother really was, even if the answer changed everything. The first article hit Emma like a physical blow: Hell's Angels president arrested in federal drug investigation. The photograph showed Stone Callahan 20 years younger, his face hard and uncompromising as federal agents led him away in handcuffs. Emma's stomach lurched as she read about racketeering charges, weapons violations, and connections to organized crime that stretched from California to Mexico. This was the man who claimed to have loved her mother. She scrolled through more results, each one painting a picture of violence and criminal enterprise that made her father's protective lies suddenly seem reasonable. Stone had served 8 years in federal prison. The Hell's Angels chapter he led had been linked to drug trafficking, money laundering, and worse. One article from 5 years ago detailed a shootout at a rival motorcycle club's headquarters that had left 2 men dead. Emma's hands trembled as she clicked on a newer article: Reformed biker seeks redemption through community outreach. The accompanying photo showed an older Stone Callahan at what appeared to be a charity event, his leather vest replaced by a simple black shirt, his expression softer but still intimidating. The article described his work with at-risk youth and substantial donations to local schools, including hers. The realization struck her with sick clarity. The fundraiser at his mansion wasn't random community involvement. Stone Callahan had been specifically supporting Emma's school for years. Had he been watching her, waiting for an opportunity to make contact? Emma? She spun around so quickly she nearly knocked over the computer monitor. Mrs. Patterson from the circulation desk stood behind her, concern creasing her elderly features. "Sweetie, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be on your way home?" Emma's mind raced. Mrs. Patterson had known her since she was small enough to need a step stool to reach the children's books. She would definitely mention this encounter to Emma's father. "I'm working on a research project," Emma said quickly, minimizing the browser window. "Extra credit for social studies." Mrs. Patterson glanced at the darkened screen with obvious curiosity. "Well, don't stay too long. Your father will worry if you're late getting home." After Mrs. Patterson walked away, Emma reopened the browser with shaking fingers. She had maybe 10 minutes before the encounter got back to her father. Scrolling frantically, she searched for any mention of her mother's name. Isabella Rodriguez? Isabella Santos? Anything that might confirm Stone's claims. Nothing. No connection between Stone Callahan and anyone named Isabella appeared in any of the articles. But in the fourth search result, buried in a police report from 15 years ago, Emma found something that made her blood freeze. Witness in federal case against Sinaloa cartel operations, found dead in apparent car accident. The witness wasn't named, but the date matched exactly with what her father had always told her about her mother's death. Emma's vision blurred as she read the sparse details. The witness had been a woman in her 20s who had provided testimony about money laundering operations. She had died when her car went off a winding road during a rainstorm, just 3 months after entering witness protection. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Her mother hadn't just been involved with dangerous people, she had betrayed them, testified against them, and someone had found her despite the federal protection. Emma printed the article with fumbling fingers and shoved it into her backpack. She needed to get home, needed to process what she'd learned, needed to figure out what Stone Callahan's role in all of this might be. But as she hurried toward the library exit, a familiar voice made her freeze. Emma Rodriguez? She turned to find a man she'd never seen before. Tall, thin, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place in the small-town library, and something about his smile made her skin crawl. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Emma asked, taking an instinctive step backward. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," he said, moving closer. "I was hoping we could chat about her. I think you'd find it very interesting to learn about Isabella's life before she met your father." Warning bells exploded in Emma's head. This wasn't coincidence. This man had been looking for her, had known she would be here, which meant he'd been watching, waiting for her to venture outside the protection her father had built around their quiet life. "I don't talk to strangers," Emma said, backing toward the circulation desk where Mrs. Patterson sat typing at her computer. "Smart girl. Your mother was smart too, sometimes too smart for her own good." His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Tell your father that Marcus Volkov sends his regards." The name hit Emma like ice water. In one of the articles she'd just read, Marcus Volkov had been identified as a lieutenant in the organization her mother had testified against, the organization that had supposedly killed her. He was supposed to be in federal prison, but he was standing in her library, smiling at her like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Emma's paralysis lasted only seconds before survival instinct kicked in. She spun toward Mrs. Patterson's desk, her voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to call my dad. Right now." The older woman looked up from her computer, immediately sensing the urgency. "Of course, dear. Use the phone at the—" Actually, Volkov's smooth voice interrupted. "I think Emma and I should finish our conversation first." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from concern to alarm as she took in the stranger's predatory smile and Emma's obvious terror. "Excuse me, sir, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a children's library, and you're making our patrons uncomfortable." Volkov's laugh was soft and cold. "I'm simply catching up with an old family friend. Isn't that right, Emma?" "No," Emma said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I've never seen him before in my life, and I want him to leave." The library suddenly felt cavernous and exposed. There were only 3 other people visible: a teenage boy wearing headphones at a corner table and 2 women browsing the fiction section. None of them had noticed the tension crackling near the circulation desk. Mrs. Patterson reached for the phone. "I'm calling security." "That won't be necessary." Volkov's tone remained pleasant, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I was just leaving. But Emma, do remember to give your father my message. Tell him Marcus Volkov is very interested in renewing old acquaintances." He turned and walked toward the exit with unhurried confidence, as if he had all the time in the world. Just before reaching the door, he glanced back. "Oh, and Emma, you have your mother's eyes. Isabella would be so proud of how you've grown up." His smile turned razor sharp. "I do hope we'll have a chance to talk again soon." The door closed behind him with a soft whisper of displaced air. Emma stood frozen until Mrs. Patterson's gentle hand on her shoulder broke the spell. "Honey, are you all right? Should I call the police?" Emma's mind raced. Calling the police would mean explanations she couldn't give, questions that would expose everything she'd been investigating. "Can I just use your phone? I need to call my dad." Mrs. Patterson guided her to the desk chair and dialed the library's main number. Emma's fingers shook as she pressed the familiar extension for the reference desk. David Rodriguez speaking. "Dad." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Emma, what's wrong? You sound—" "Someone was here. A man named Marcus Volkov. He said he knew Mom." The silence on the other end stretched so long Emma wondered if the call had dropped. When her father finally spoke, his voice was completely transformed, tight with a fear she'd never heard from him before. "Where are you right now?" "The downtown library. Mrs. Patterson is here with me, but he left." "Dad, he said to tell you he wants to renew old acquaintances and he—" "Listen to me very carefully." Her father's words came rapid fire, clipped with urgency. "Do not leave that library. Do not go anywhere alone. I'm calling someone to come get you, and I'm on my way. Do exactly what Mrs. Patterson tells you until I arrive. Do you understand?" "Dad, what's happening? Who is he?" "Emma, I need you to promise me you understand what I just said." The controlled terror in his voice cut through her confusion. "I understand? Good. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Emma stared at the phone, her father's fear infecting her like a virus. In 12 years, she had never heard David Rodriguez sound anything less than competent and calm. He was the man who read bedtime stories in different voices, who built elaborate Halloween costumes from cardboard and paint, who had once spent 3 hours helping her save a wounded bird they'd found in their backyard. That man was gone. The person who had just spoken to her was someone else entirely, someone who knew exactly who Marcus Volkov was and why his presence in Emma's life represented a threat worth panic. Mrs. Patterson was watching her with obvious concern. "Your father is coming?" He said 20 minutes. Emma's voice sounded small even to her own ears. "Mrs. Patterson, has anyone else been asking about me? Anyone you didn't recognize?" "No, sweetie. Although—" She paused, her weathered brow furrowing with concentration. "There was a man here yesterday evening, after you'd left. He didn't ask about you specifically, but he was very interested in which schools use our research computers for student projects. I thought it was odd at the time." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Volkov hadn't found her by chance. He'd been watching, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment to make contact when she was alone and vulnerable, which meant her search for information about Stone Callahan had led something far more dangerous directly to her door. Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of Mrs. Patterson's desk. The realization that she had been watched, studied, hunted like prey, made her stomach lurch with a sick understanding of how exposed she truly was. Every trip to the library, every walk home from school, every moment she'd felt safe in her small-town routine, Volkov had been cataloging it all, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "I need to call someone else," Emma said, her voice barely steady. "Can I use the phone again?" Mrs. Patterson nodded, hovering protectively as Emma dialed the number she'd memorized from Stone Callahan's business card. The irony wasn't lost on her. Calling a Hell's Angel for protection from a man her father clearly feared more than any leather-clad biker. "Yeah?" Stone's gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "It's Emma Rodriguez. Something's happened." The background noise, what sounded like motorcycle engines and male voices, cut off abruptly. "Where are you?" "The downtown library. A man named Marcus Volkov was here. He said he knew my mother and he—" "Jesus Christ." Stone's voice turned deadly serious. "Are you alone?" "Mrs. Patterson is here, but my dad is coming. He sounded terrified when I told him about Volkov, and I don't understand what's happening." "Listen to me, kid. Volkov is bad news. The kind of bad that makes what people think about my club look like Sunday school. If he's found you, it means the protection your old man built around you just collapsed." Emma's legs felt weak. She sank into Mrs. Patterson's chair, trying to process the implications. What did my mother do? Why does he want to find me? That's a conversation for when you're somewhere safe. Right now, I need you to stay exactly where you are until your father arrives. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust anyone you don't recognize, and if Volkov comes back, you scream loud enough to wake the dead. The phone went silent, but Emma could hear Stone talking to someone else in rapid, urgent tones. When he came back on the line, his voice carried a new weight of authority. I'm sending 2 of my guys to watch the library until your father gets there. You won't see them, but they'll be close. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get to Mrs. Patterson and you make noise. Why are you helping me? The question escaped before Emma could stop it. Stone's pause stretched long enough that she wondered if he would answer. When he did, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Because your mother asked me to. If anything ever happened to the life your father built for you both. She made me promise that if Volkov ever found you, I'd keep you safe until David could figure out what to do next. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mother had known this day might come, had planned for it, arranged protection, understood that the careful lies and quiet life might someday crumble. Which meant Isabella Rodriguez, whoever she really was, had loved her daughter enough to prepare for threats that existed beyond Emma's comprehension. She knew he would come for me? She knew there was a chance. Volkov doesn't forget, and he sure as hell doesn't forgive. Your mother cost him everything when she testified against his operation. He's been in federal prison for the last 10 years, but word is he got out 6 months ago. Emma's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she'd read about witness protection and cartel operations. If she testified against him, why didn't the government keep protecting us? Because officially, Isabella Santos died in that car accident 15 years ago. The woman who testified doesn't exist anymore, and neither does her daughter. You've been living under identities your father created, completely outside any federal protection. The library around Emma seemed to shift and blur as the full scope of her father's deception became clear. David Rodriguez wasn't just her father, he was a man who had somehow erased their old lives so completely that even the federal government believed they were dead. The quiet librarian who helped patrons find recipe books and assisted with homework had managed to disappear so thoroughly that it had taken Volkov a decade and a half to find them. Emma? Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Honey, you're very pale. Should I get you some water? Emma looked up at the elderly woman who had been part of her life for as long as she could remember, wondering how many other people in their small town were part of an elaborate fiction designed to keep her safe. How many friendships, how many casual conversations, how many ordinary moments had been carefully constructed to maintain the illusion that Emma Rodriguez was exactly who she appeared to be. The library doors opened, and Emma's heart lurched, but it was her father, moving faster than she'd ever seen him, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and his face pale with controlled panic. When David Rodriguez's eyes found hers across the library, Emma saw her worst fears confirmed. Everything she had believed about her life, her family, her identity, all of it was about to shatter completely. Dad? Emma's voice cracked as David Rodriguez approached the circulation desk, his familiar face transformed by an expression of raw terror she'd never witnessed before. The man who had always been her anchor, her constant source of calm reassurance, looked like he was barely holding himself together. Are you hurt? His hands moved over her shoulders, her arms, checking for injuries with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood exactly what Marcus Volkov was capable of. Did he touch you? Threaten you? No, he just talked to me. But Dad, how do you know who he is? Stone Callahan said Mom testified against him, that he's been in prison, that we're living under fake identities. The words tumbled out in a rush, each revelation a small explosion that made her father's face grow paler. David's eyes darted to Mrs. Patterson, who was watching their exchange with obvious confusion and growing alarm. Thank you for keeping her safe, Margaret. We need to go now. David, what's happening? That man who was here? He didn't seem right. Should I call the police? Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades protecting children in her library. No police. The sharpness in her father's tone made Emma flinch. He caught himself, softening his voice with visible effort. It's a family matter. We'll handle it. But as they moved toward the exit, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Beautiful girl. Your mother would have been so proud to see how much you've grown. Tell David that old debts don't disappear just because you change your name. We'll talk again very soon. MV. Emma's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Dad, he has my number. David read the message over her shoulder, and whatever control he'd been maintaining cracked completely. Christ, he's not just back, he's been planning this. His eyes scanned the library's windows, the exit, every corner where a threat might be hiding. We have to go, now. They rushed toward his car, but as they reached the parking lot, David suddenly stopped. Emma, I need you to understand something before we get in that car. Everything I'm about to tell you will change how you see our life, our family, everything you thought you knew about who you are. I already know some of it. I found articles about witness protection, about someone who testified against the Sinaloa cartel. The dates match when you said Mom died. Emma's voice was stronger now, fueled by a desperate need for truth. Her name wasn't Isabella Rodriguez, was it? Isabella Santos. Her father's admission came out as a whisper. She was 22 when she got involved with people she thought were legitimate businessmen. By the time she realized what they really were, she was already pregnant with you and trapped in something that would have killed you both. The world seemed to tilt sideways. So she did testify? She did help send them to prison? She was going to. But the night before she was supposed to appear in court, someone tried to kill her. The car accident was real, Emma, but it wasn't an accident. David's voice broke completely. I was a federal technician then, part of the team that created new identities for witnesses. When I saw her in that hospital, fighting for her life because she'd tried to do the right thing, I knew I couldn't let the system fail her again. What do you mean? I mean, I stole you both. Created completely new identities outside any federal oversight. Moved us somewhere the government databases said we didn't exist. For 12 years, we've been ghosts. Emma felt the last of her old world crumbling away. The quiet librarian father she'd known was actually a federal fugitive who had spent over a decade hiding in plain sight. Their peaceful small-town life was an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to protect a woman who had died trying to bring down a cartel. But if Mom died in the hospital, why does Volkov want me? David's pause stretched too long, and Emma saw a new kind of fear flicker across his features. Because your mother didn't die in the hospital, Emma. She survived, but she was so badly injured, so traumatized, that she couldn't care for you. I've been hiding you from Volkov, yes, but I've also been hiding you from her. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Everything, every assumption, every story, every foundation of her identity had been built on lies. Her mother was alive. Had been alive this entire time while Emma grieved for a woman who existed somewhere in the world, breathing, thinking, perhaps wondering about the daughter she'd been separated from. Where is she? Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. But before David could answer, another text lit up her phone. Ask your father where he's been hiding Isabella. Ask him why he never told her that her daughter survived. Ask him who the real villain is in this story. Emma looked at her father, seeing a stranger wearing the face of the man who had raised her, and realized that everything she had lost was nothing compared to what she was about to discover. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and Emma's own ragged breathing. She stared at the text message, then at her father's face, watching as 12 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in real time. She thinks I'm dead. The words escaped Emma's lips as understanding crashed over her. My mother thinks I'm dead, and you let her believe it. David's composure finally shattered completely. Emma, you don't understand the situation I was in. She was barely alive, her memory was damaged from the head trauma, and Volkov had people everywhere, even in the federal system, even in the hospitals. So you decided for her? You decided for both of us? Emma's voice rose, drawing concerned glances from people walking past the library. How could you do that? How could you let her spend 12 years thinking her daughter was dead? Because keeping you both dead was the only way to keep you both alive. David's desperate whisper was fierce with anguish. Do you think this was easy for me? Do you think I wanted to be the person who made that choice? Emma looked down at her phone as another message appeared. She lives in a small town in Oregon now. Goes by the name Sarah Mitchell. Works at a flower shop on Main Street. She visits a small grave with your name on it every month. Your father is a monster who convinced everyone, including her, that both of you died in that car crash. The world tilted sideways. Her mother was real, alive, grieving for a daughter who was standing in a library parking lot reading about her own fake death. Emma could picture it. A woman she'd never remembered kneeling beside a headstone, leaving flowers for a child who had grown up 3 states away, raised by the very man who had orchestrated the elaborate lie. Dad. Emma's voice was hollow now, drained of everything except a terrible understanding. She's been mourning me. For 12 years, she's been visiting my grave. David's face crumpled. I know. God help me, I know. And you never told her? Never once reached out to let her know I was alive and safe? I couldn't risk it. Any contact, any hint that we existed, would have led Volkov straight to all of us. At least this way, she was safe. You were safe. The sacrifice was worth... Sacrifice? Emma's voice cracked like a whip. You didn't sacrifice anything. You stole everything. You stole her right to know her daughter was alive. You stole my right to know my mother existed. You played God with our lives and convinced yourself it was noble. The truth was reshaping everything she had ever believed about the man who raised her. David Rodriguez wasn't the selfless protector she'd imagined. He was a man who had made an impossible choice and then spent over a decade doubling down on it, building lie upon lie until he'd created a prison of his own making. Another text. Would you like to see a picture of her, Emma? Would you like to know what your mother looks like when she thinks no one is watching her grieve? Don't. David lunged for the phone, but Emma stepped back, her movements sharp with newfound anger. Don't what? Don't learn about my own mother? Don't discover that everything you told me about our life was a lie designed to make you feel better about what you'd done? That's not... David stopped, his face gray with exhaustion. Emma, I know how this looks. I know what you must think of me now. But Volkov isn't texting you because he wants to reunite a family. He's doing this because he knows that tearing apart everything I built is the best way to destroy us all. Emma stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. The quiet strength she'd always admired was really guilt disguised as protectiveness. The calm wisdom was actually the careful control of someone living with a secret so massive it had consumed their entire existence. Every bedtime story, every school conference, every ordinary moment of their life together had been tainted by the knowledge that he had stolen her from a woman who loved her. She loved me enough to risk everything to protect me from those people, Emma said quietly. And you loved me enough to protect me from her. But who was protecting her from thinking her daughter was dead? The question hung in the air like an accusation. For the first time since she'd discovered her mother's photograph in Stone Callahan's mansion, Emma understood that the mystery she'd been trying to solve wasn't about cartels or witness protection or dangerous criminals hunting innocent families. It was about a man who had convinced himself that love justified any lie, and a woman who had spent 12 years mourning a child who was very much alive. I want to see her, Emma said, and her voice carried a finality that made David flinch. Emma, please, I want to see my mother. The words hung between them like a bridge Emma was determined to cross, no matter what waited on the other side. David's face cycled through a dozen emotions: fear, guilt, desperate love, and something that looked almost like relief. If we do this, he said finally, his voice barely audible, there's no going back. Once Volkov knows we've made contact with her, once that connection is re-established, everything changes. The safety I built for you, for her, it all disappears. Emma felt something crystallize inside her chest, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. The safety was built on a lie that was destroying all of us. Maybe it's time for it to disappear. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she answered it instead of reading a text. Volkov's smooth voice filled the space between her and her father like poison. "Smart girl. I was hoping you'd be ready to have a real conversation. What do you want?" Emma's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "Justice. Your father cost me 15 years of my life, and your mother cost me everything I'd built. But I'm not an unreasonable man. I believe in equivalent exchange." David was gesturing frantically for her to hang up, but Emma found herself oddly calm. The terror that had gripped her in the library was transforming into something else, a cold anger that reminded her, disturbingly, of Stone Callahan's controlled fury. What kind of exchange? Information for information. Reunion for reunion. I tell you exactly where to find Isabella Santos, and you tell me exactly where David Rodriguez has been hiding for the last 12 years. So, you can kill him? Volkov's laugh was genuinely amused. "Child, if I wanted your father dead, he would have been dead years ago. No, I want something much more satisfying than his death. I want him to live knowing that his elaborate house of cards collapsed the moment his daughter learned the truth." Emma looked at her father, seeing the man who had read her bedtime stories, taught her to ride a bicycle, helped with homework, attended every school play. The man who had also stolen her from her mother and built their entire life on a foundation of lies. "I'm not making any deals with you," she said into the phone, "but I am going to find her myself." She hung up before Volkov could respond and immediately dialed Stone Callahan's number. "Emma? Jesus, where are you? My guys said they saw your father arrive, but then you both disappeared from their sightline. We're in the parking lot. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Shoot. My mother is alive. She's living in Oregon under the name Sarah Mitchell. Did you know?" Stone's pause told her everything before he spoke. "Yeah, kid, I knew." "How long have you known?" "About 8 years. I found her by accident when I was up there on club business. Recognized her even though she'd changed her hair, lost weight, looked older. She didn't recognize me." Emma felt her father's eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the phone. "Did you ever think about telling her about me?" "Every damn day. But your father made me promise when I first found out about you that I'd never contact her directly. Said it would put you both in danger. What if my father wasn't part of this equation anymore? What if I made my own decisions about my own life?" Stone's voice grew very careful. "What are you thinking, Emma?" "I'm thinking I'm 12 years old, not 2. I'm thinking I'm smart enough to understand danger and brave enough to face it. And I'm thinking that my mother has suffered enough." She could hear motorcycle engines in the background, voices conferring in urgent tones. "Where's your father right now?" "Standing 3 feet away from me looking like his world is ending." "Put him on the phone." Emma handed the phone to David, watching his face change as Stone spoke. The conversation was brief, tense, full of words she couldn't quite catch. When her father handed the phone back, his expression had shifted into something that looked almost like acceptance. "Stone wants to meet with both of us," David said quietly. "Tonight. He says there's a way to do this that might keep everyone alive." "And you trust him?" "I trust that he loved your mother enough to keep her secret for 8 years, and that he cares about you enough to put himself between you and Volkov." David's smile was heartbreaking. "Besides, what choice do we have? The lies are finished, Emma. All of them." Emma looked at her phone as one final text appeared. "Until tonight, then. Give my regards to Stone." But for the first time since discovering her mother's photograph, Emma wasn't afraid. She had allies now, a plan forming, and most importantly, she had the truth. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself. Not as the carefully constructed fiction her father had created, but as Emma Rodriguez, daughter of Isabella Santos, and someone brave enough to fight for the family she'd never known she had. The gathering storm felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The ride to Stone Callahan's compound felt like crossing into another world entirely. Emma sat in the passenger seat of her father's sedan, watching the familiar streets of their quiet neighborhood give way to winding roads that climbed into the hills where shadows gathered thick between the trees. The silence between them had evolved beyond awkwardness into something that felt almost sacred, the quiet of two people who had finally stopped lying to each other. David's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and Emma could see the muscle in his jaw working as they approached the gates of the compound. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were seeking protection from the very man her father had spent 12 years teaching her to fear. But then again, everything she'd been taught to fear had proven to be a carefully constructed misdirection from the real dangers that had been circling them all along. "There's no shame in turning back," David said as they pulled up to the gate, where two leather-clad men emerged from the shadows. "We could disappear again. I still have contacts, resources. We could build new identities, start over somewhere Volkov would never think to look." Emma studied her father's profile in the dim light from the compound's security lamps. "And leave my mother thinking I'm dead forever?" The question hung between them as one of Stone's men approached the driver's side window. David rolled it down, his hands steady despite everything. "David Rodriguez and Emma Rodriguez to see Stone," her father said. And Emma noticed how strange their real names sounded after years of casual aliases and careful misdirection. They were waved through, and as they drove up the long driveway toward the mansion where this had all begun just days ago, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had driven her since finding her mother's photograph was crystallizing into something harder, more purposeful. She wasn't just uncovering secrets anymore, she was taking control of her own story. Stone was waiting on the front steps, his massive frame somehow managing to look both menacing and oddly comforting in the porch light. As they approached, Emma could see the careful way he watched her father, the tension of two men who had been circling each other's secrets for years finally meeting in the open. David Stone's greeting was neutral, professional. "Marcus." Her father's response carried 12 years of complicated history. "Emma." When Stone looked at her, his expression softened into something that reminded her powerfully of the way he'd looked at her mother's photograph. "You sure about this path you're choosing? Once we start down this road, there's no protecting you from the truth anymore." Emma thought about her mother visiting a grave that bore her name, leaving flowers for a daughter who was standing here making the choice to shatter 12 years of carefully maintained lies. "I'm sure." They followed Stone into the mansion, past the very room where Emma had first seen her mother's photograph. The leather and wood that had seemed intimidating days ago now felt like a fortress, a place where truth could finally be spoken without fear. Stone led them to a different room, smaller and more intimate, where a fire crackled in a stone fireplace and weapons were displayed on the walls. With the casual precision of a man who understood exactly how dangerous the world could be. "Volkov made contact," Stone said without preamble as they settled into chairs around the fireplace. "Not just with Emma, with me, with some of my contacts in Oregon. He's moving pieces into position." David leaned forward. "What kind of pieces?" "The kind that suggest he's not planning to wait much longer for whatever reunion he has in mind." Stone's eyes found Emma's. "He knows you know about your mother now. That changes the game completely." Emma felt the weight of being the catalyst for everything that was about to unfold. What does he really want? It can't just be revenge after all this time. Stone and her father exchanged a look that carried years of shared understanding about dangers Emma was only beginning to comprehend. "Your mother didn't just testify against Volkov's operation," Stone said carefully. "She took something when she left. Information that could bring down networks that have grown much larger in the 15 years since he went to prison. If he can get her to tell him where she hid it. She could destroy everything he's rebuilt." David finished quietly. Emma absorbed this, understanding finally crystallizing. "So I'm not just her daughter. I'm leverage." "You're the one thing in the world she'd trade everything to protect," Stone confirmed. "Just like you're the one thing your father traded everything to protect. The question is what you're willing to trade to protect her." Emma looked between the two men who had spent years loving her mother in different ways, who had each made impossible choices in the name of keeping her safe. Then she thought about a woman in Oregon who visited a grave that shouldn't exist, who had spent 12 years grieving for a daughter who was very much alive. "Everything," Emma said, and her voice carried a finality that made both men straighten. "I'm willing to trade everything." The silence that followed Emma's declaration stretched like a held breath. Stone's eyes never left her face, searching for any trace of childish bravado or naive heroism. What he found instead seemed to satisfy something deep in his assessment of her character. "Then we do this right," Stone said, rising from his chair with fluid precision. "But first, you need to understand exactly what everything means." He moved to a wall safe, hidden behind a painting of motorcycles, racing through desert landscape. The combination lock clicked with mechanical certainty as he worked the tumblers, and when the door swung open, Emma could see stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like multiple sets of identification papers. "Your mother was smarter than any of us gave her credit for," Stone said, extracting a thick manila envelope. When she agreed to testify against Volkov, she didn't just memorize account numbers and business connections. She copied everything. Every transaction, every contact, every piece of evidence that could rebuild the entire network if it ever needed rebuilding. David straightened in his chair. "I thought the feds had everything." "They had what she gave them. But Isabella Santos was a woman who understood that information was the only real power she'd ever have." Stone's smile held equal parts admiration and regret. "She kept insurance, and she told me where to find it if anything ever happened to her." Emma felt the pieces clicking together with terrible clarity. "That's why you never contacted her directly, because you knew what she was carrying." "I knew that the moment anyone connected her current identity to her past identity, every criminal organization that Volkov's testimony had damaged would come hunting." Stone returned to his chair, the envelope balanced carefully on his knees. "Your father made the right choice, Emma. As much as it's cost all of you, he made the right choice." "But now Volkov knows she exists again," Emma said, understanding flooding through her. "And he knows I exist. So the protection is already gone." David's voice was hollow. "Which means we're all exposed now anyway." Stone nodded grimly. "Volkov's endgame isn't just revenge. He wants that information so he can disappear completely. New identity, new operation, beyond the reach of everyone he's betrayed over the years. Your mother's insurance policy becomes his get-out-of-jail-free card." Emma stood up, moving to the fireplace where flames danced against blackened stone. The heat warmed her face, but inside she felt something cold and determined taking shape. "So we use that. We use the fact that he wants the information more than he wants revenge." "Emma," her father's voice carried a warning. But Stone leaned forward, sudden interest sharpening his features. "What are you thinking?" Emma turned back to face them, and in the firelight, both men could see something that hadn't been there before. A calculation that belonged to someone much older than 12, a willingness to embrace danger that reminded Stone powerfully of the woman in the photograph upstairs. "I'm thinking that Volkov has been playing a game where he holds all the cards because we've been trying to protect secrets that are already exposed. But what if we stopped protecting the secrets and started using them?" David shook his head. "You can't seriously be suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that my mother has spent 12 years in hiding because she was afraid to use the power she actually had. And you've spent 12 years building walls because you were afraid to trust her with the truth about her own life." Emma's voice gained strength as the plan crystallized. "But what if we brought everyone together? What if we stopped running from Volkov and made him come to us, on our terms, in a place where we controlled what happened?" Stone exchanged a long look with David, and Emma could see the reluctant recognition in both their faces. The child they had been trying to protect was proposing something that required her to step fully into the adult world of choices and consequences. "That's not a plan, Emma," David said quietly. "That's a declaration of war." "No," Emma corrected, moving back toward them with steady steps. "What Volkov's doing is a declaration of war. What I'm suggesting is that we finally fight back." Stone opened the manila envelope, spreading photographs and documents across the coffee table between them. Emma could see bank statements, shipping manifests, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands in anonymous hotel rooms. The evidence of an empire built on violence and corruption, waiting to be used by whoever was brave enough to wield it. "Your mother's been sitting on enough evidence to bring down half the criminal networks on the West Coast," Stone said. "But using it means exposing herself completely. Emma looked at the photographs spread before them, understanding that each document represented a choice: safety or truth, protection or justice, the life her father had built for her, or the life she might build for herself. "Then we bring her home first," Emma said simply. "We bring her home, tell her everything, and let her decide what she wants to do with the power she's been carrying all these years." The plan was forming now, dangerous and precise as the weapons on Stone's walls. The plan materialized with deadly precision over the next hour. Each detail hammered out against the backdrop of crackling fire and the weight of 12 years of accumulated secrets. But as Stone made the calls that would set everything in motion, Emma felt the familiar cold grip of fear returning, not for herself, but for what they were about to ask of a woman who had already sacrificed everything once. "She deserves to know you're alive before we ask her to risk her life again," Stone said, ending his conversation with contacts in Oregon. "I'm sending 2 of my best riders north tonight. They'll bring her back safely, but Emma—" His eyes found hers across the room. "You need to understand that seeing you might destroy her just as much as losing you did." Emma nodded, though the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical thing. They were planning to resurrect a dead daughter, to shatter 12 years of carefully maintained grief, and then immediately ask Isabella Santos to step back into the world that had nearly killed her. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "There's something else," David said quietly. He'd been silent for most of the planning, his face growing more haggard with each tactical detail. "If we're really doing this, if we're really bringing Volkov into a direct confrontation, then Emma can't be anywhere near the actual meeting." "No." Emma's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "I won't hide anymore while other people fight battles that are about my life." Stone's phone buzzed, and his expression darkened as he read the message. "Volkov's not waiting for us to make the first move. He just bought a plane ticket to San Francisco. Arrives tomorrow night." The air in the room seemed to crystallize around them. Tomorrow night, less than 24 hours to bring Isabella Santos home, to reunite a family that had been scattered by violence, and to face down a man who had spent 15 years planning his revenge. "Then we accelerate everything," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We bring her home tomorrow morning, we tell her everything, and we let her choose how this ends." David stood abruptly, moving to the window where he could see Stone's men patrolling the compound perimeter. "You're talking about using your mother as bait. I'm talking about treating her like an adult who gets to make her own decisions." Emma's words carried a sharp edge that made both men look at her. "Just like I'm an adult who gets to make mine." Stone's phone rang, and he answered with terse efficiency. Emma watched his face change as he listened, watched the careful control he maintained slip just enough to reveal the danger beneath. "We've got movement," Stone said, ending the call. "Volkov's people are already in the city. They just made contact with some of the local operations, asking questions about David Rodriguez, about a girl matching Emma's description." The safe house that had felt like a fortress suddenly felt like a trap. Emma could see the same realization dawning on her father's face. They had run out of time for careful planning and gradual approaches. Whatever happened next would unfold with the brutal speed of violence unleashed. "How long do we have?" David asked. "Maybe hours, maybe less." Stone was already moving, gathering weapons from the wall display with practiced efficiency. "My contacts in Oregon confirm Isabella's location, but getting her here safely means moving her through territory that Volkov's people might already be watching." Emma felt the plan shifting around them, becoming something rawer and more desperate than the careful strategy they'd been constructing. "What if we don't bring her here? What if we go to her?" "That's exactly what Volkov expects," Stone said. "He's counting on us running, on us trying to protect her by staying hidden. He's got people positioned to intercept us the moment we move toward Oregon." The trap was closing with inexorable precision, and Emma could see the terrible mathematics of their situation. Stay here, and Volkov would find them within hours. Run to Isabella, and they would lead him straight to her. Fight, and they would be facing an enemy who had spent 15 years preparing for this moment while they had spent 15 years trying to avoid it. "Then we change the game entirely," Emma said, and something in her voice made both men stop what they were doing. "We don't hide and we don't run. We call him directly and tell him exactly where to find us." "Emma." "No," David started. But Stone was looking at her with a new kind of respect, seeing the echo of Isabella Santos in the 12-year-old girl who was proposing to walk directly into the heart of the storm. "You want to meet him here, on our ground, with our advantages." "I want to stop being afraid of him," Emma said simply. "I want to look the man who destroyed my family in the face and tell him that he failed, that we're still here, still together, and still stronger than his revenge." The confrontation was no longer approaching. It was here, crystallizing around them with the weight of inevitability and the sharp edge of choice. The weight of Emma's words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, and David felt something inside his chest crack open, not with fear, but with a terrible pride. His 12-year-old daughter was proposing to face down a killer with the kind of courage he'd spent years trying to shield her from needing. "You understand what you're asking," Stone said, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who'd seen too many battles to romanticize them. "You're asking to trade your childhood for your family's freedom." Emma nodded, her face reflecting the firelight with an intensity that made her look years older. "I lost my childhood the moment I found that photograph. At least this way, I get to choose what I lose it for." Stone moved to his desk, extracting a secure phone that looked military in its efficiency. "Then we do this clean and fast. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures. We call Volkov, we set the meet, and we end this tonight." "Wait." David stepped forward, his hand reaching for the phone. "Before we make that call, before we commit to this path, Emma needs to talk to her mother first." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Emma felt her heart stop, then resume beating with painful intensity. "She doesn't even know I'm alive. Which is why she needs to hear your voice before we ask her to walk into a trap." David's eyes met Stone's across the room. "Your people can get her on a secure line?" Stone nodded slowly. "They're with her now. But David, once we make contact, once Isabella knows Emma's alive, there's no containing her anymore. She'll move heaven and earth to get here, regardless of the danger." Emma felt the magnitude of what they were proposing wash over her. In the space of a single phone call, she would resurrect herself from the dead and simultaneously put her mother in mortal danger. The mathematical cruelty of it was breathtaking. "Do it," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Stone dialed with mechanical precision, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Emma could hear the muffled sound of voices, of movement, of a woman being told that the daughter she'd grieved for 12 years was about to speak to her. Emma Stone held out the phone, and she could see something like reverence in his eyes. "Remember that she's about to lose 12 years of careful control in the space of a heartbeat. Be gentle." Emma took the phone with hands that trembled despite her determination. She could hear breathing on the other end, careful and controlled, and then a voice that sounded exactly like her own but layered with years of loss. "Emma? Is it really you?" The sound of her mother's voice shattered something inside Emma's chest that she hadn't realized she'd been protecting. All the courage, all the determination, all the adult choices she'd been making dissolved into the simple, devastating reality of a daughter talking to the mother who thought she was dead. "Mom," Emma whispered, and the word carried 12 years of absence. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you thought I was gone." Isabella's sob came through the phone like a physical blow. "Oh my God, baby. Oh my God, how is this possible?" Emma looked at her father, seeing the tears streaming down his face as he watched her navigate the most important conversation of her life. "Dad kept me safe. He kept me hidden. But Mom, there's something you need to know. We're all in danger now." The story spilled out in fragments. Volkov's return, the hunt that was closing in, the choice they were about to make to face him directly rather than keep running. With each detail, Emma could hear her mother's breathing change, could feel Isabella Santos, the woman who'd been strong enough to testify against a killer, reassembling herself on the other end of the line. "You're planning to use yourselves as bait," Isabella said when Emma finished. and her voice carried the hard edge of a woman who understood exactly what that meant. "We're planning to stop being afraid," Emma corrected. "But Mom, we can't do this without you, and we can't protect you if you're not with us." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of impossible choices. Emma could picture her mother in whatever safe house Stone's people had found, staring at walls that had protected her for 12 years while deciding whether to step back into the world that had nearly destroyed her family. "I'll leave within the hour," Isabella said finally. "But Emma, promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, when Volkov is no longer a threat, you'll let yourself be a child again. Even if it's only for a little while." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of what she was about to sacrifice. The safety her father had built, the innocence she'd maintained despite everything, the luxury of believing that someone else would always handle the dangerous choices. "I promise," she said, knowing it was the last lie she would ever tell her mother. The phone went silent, leaving only the ghost of Isabella's voice hanging in the air like incense. Emma held the device for several heartbeats longer than necessary, as if maintaining the connection might somehow bridge the 12 years that had just collapsed between them. When she finally handed it back to Stone, her fingers were steady, but David could see something fundamental had shifted in his daughter's eyes, the last traces of childhood dissolving into something harder and more permanent. "She's coming," Emma said unnecessarily. They had all heard the determination in Isabella's voice, the sound of a woman who had spent over a decade in careful hiding suddenly willing to risk everything for the daughter she'd thought was lost forever. Stone pocketed the phone and moved to the window, scanning the perimeter with practiced efficiency. "My people will have her here within 6 hours, but that gives Volkov's team plenty of time to position themselves." He turned back to face them, his expression grim. "Once Isabella arrives, we make the call. No delays, no second guessing." David sank into his chair, the weight of accumulated exhaustion finally catching up with him. For 12 years, he had carried the burden of impossible choices alone. Every birthday celebrated in secret, every school event attended under false pretenses, every moment of Emma's life carefully constructed to hide her from the world that wanted to destroy her. Now, watching his daughter prepare to walk directly into that world, he felt the crushing responsibility of having failed to protect her from this moment. "I should have told you years ago," he said quietly. "I should have trusted you with the truth about your mother, about what we were running from." Emma moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers with an iron poker. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows across her face. "You gave me 12 years of feeling safe," she said without looking at him. 12 years of believing that someone else would handle the dangerous choices. "That's not a failure, Dad. That's a gift." Stone's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and his expression darkened as he read it. "Volkov's moved up his timeline. He's not waiting until tomorrow night. His plane lands in 4 hours." The room seemed to contract around them. The careful strategies they'd been building suddenly compressed into a handful of desperate hours. Emma felt the familiar cold grip of fear, but beneath it was something new, a strange calm that came from finally moving toward the confrontation instead of away from it. "Then we accelerate everything," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had marked every major decision over the past few days. "Mom will be here in 6 hours, Volkov in 4. We use those 2 hours to prepare." David stood abruptly, moving to where Emma stood by the fire. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to pull her away from the flames, to shield her from the heat and light and danger. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know this changes everything," he said softly. "After tonight, we can't go back to the quiet life we built. Emma Rodriguez, the librarian's daughter from Mill Valley, that girl disappears tonight, regardless of what happens with Volkov." Emma nodded, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. The life her father had so carefully constructed, the safety, the anonymity, the luxury of invisible normalcy, would be sacrificed on the altar of truth. Win or lose, she would emerge from this night as someone entirely different. "I know," she said simply. "But Dad, I don't think I was ever really that girl anyway. I think I was always Isabella Santos's daughter, just waiting for the moment when I'd have to prove it. Stone moved away from the window, satisfaction and concern warring in his expression. My people confirm Isabella's en route, but they're also picking up increased chatter from Volkov's network. He's not coming alone, and he's not planning to negotiate. The implications hung between them like a blade. This would not be a careful exchange of information or a strategic resolution of competing interests. This would be the violent culmination of 15 years of accumulated rage, played out in the space of Stone's compound with Emma's family as the stakes. Emma turned away from the fire, facing both men with the same steady courage that had carried her through every revelation of the past week. Then we make sure we're ready for violence. But we also make sure Mom knows exactly what she's walking into when she gets here. David felt something break open in his chest. Not fear, but a terrible, overwhelming pride. His daughter was no longer asking for protection or hoping someone else would make the hard choices. She was stepping fully into the adult world of consequences and calculated risks, and doing it with a grace that reminded him powerfully of the woman who had given birth to her. The waiting began in earnest now, measured in heartbeats and the careful checking of weapons, in the sound of cars arriving at the compound's gates and the weight of a family preparing to either reclaim their freedom or die in the attempt. The first sound was gravel crunching under tires, distant but unmistakable through the pre-dawn silence that had settled over Stone's compound. Emma stood at the window where she'd spent most of the last 2 hours, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of daylight, and felt her heart stop as headlights swept across the main gate. "She's here," Stone said unnecessarily, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that everything was about to change. Emma's hands pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched the black sedan navigate the winding drive toward the main house. Somewhere in that approaching vehicle was the woman who had given birth to her, who had held her as an infant, who had made the impossible choice to let her daughter believe she was dead rather than risk her life. The mathematics of reunion felt suddenly overwhelming. How did you bridge 12 years of absence in the shadow of approaching violence? David moved to stand beside her, his reflection ghost-like in the window. "Are you ready for this?" Emma almost laughed at the question. Nothing could prepare someone for resurrection, for the moment when grief was transformed into joy and then immediately threatened with loss again. But she nodded anyway, understanding that readiness was less important than willingness. The sedan pulled to a stop in the circular drive, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Emma could imagine the conversation taking place in the vehicle, Stone's men briefing Isabella on the security situation, on the timing of Volkov's arrival, on the risks of the reunion she was about to experience. Then the passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out into the pale morning light. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The woman moving toward the house was older than the mother she remembered, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face marked by years of carefully controlled sorrow. But the way she moved, the set of her shoulders, the determined grace of her stride, it was like watching herself aged by decades of loss. Isabella paused at the foot of the front steps, looking up at the windows where she seemed to know her family was waiting. Even from a distance, Emma could see the tears streaming down her mother's face, could see the way her hands trembled as she prepared to enter a world where her daughter was alive. "Go," David said softly. "She's waited long enough." Emma moved through the house like she was walking through a dream, her feet carrying her down the hallway and toward the front door without conscious direction. Behind her, she could hear Stone speaking in low tones into his radio, coordinating security, preparing for the violence that would follow this moment of grace. But all of that felt distant and theoretical compared to the reality of her hand on the door handle. She opened the door as Isabella reached the top step, and for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, mother and daughter stood facing each other across a threshold that had taken 12 years to cross. Isabella was smaller than Emma remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were exactly the same, dark and warm and filled with the same fierce intelligence that Emma saw in her own reflection. Those eyes were now wide with disbelief, with joy so profound it looked like pain. "Emma," Isabella whispered, and the word carried the weight of every birthday she'd missed, Every milestone she'd grieve from a distance. Every night she'd fallen asleep wondering if her daughter remembered her face. "Mom." Emma stepped forward, and then they were embracing with a desperation that spoke to 12 years of enforced separation. Isabella's arms wrapped around her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had been denied the right to hold her child, and Emma felt something inside her chest finally settle into place, a piece of herself she hadn't realized was missing. They stood like that for long minutes, holding each other in the doorway, while dawn broke over the mountains and Stone's men maintained their careful watch. Emma could feel her mother's tears soaking into her shirt, could hear the whispered words of love and apology and disbelief that poured from Isabella like water from a broken dam. When they finally separated, Isabella's hands cupped Emma's face with infinite gentleness. "You're so beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "So strong. I can see your father in you, but also you," Emma finished. "Stone showed me your picture. He told me about who you were before." Isabella's expression shifted, the joy tempered by understanding of what that knowledge meant. "And now, you know why this is so dangerous. Why we can never really be safe until we face him," Emma said. "Together. As a family." Isabella looked past her daughter to where David stood in the hallway, and Emma watched 12 years of separation and sacrifice pass between her parents in a single glance. There would be time later for their own reunion, their own reckoning with the choices that had scattered their family across the landscape of fear. Right now, there was only the approaching storm and the family that had finally come together to meet it. The new beginning. The call came at dawn 3 months later, just as Emma was preparing for her first day at her new school. Stone's voice was uncharacteristically gentle when he delivered the news. Volkov was dead, killed in a federal raid on his remaining network in Miami. The last thread connecting them to 15 years of running had finally been severed. Emma set down the phone and looked around the kitchen of their new home, a modest house in Sebastopol that Isabella had chosen for its proximity to both David's new library position and Stone's compound. It was strange how normal everything felt now, how the rhythms of family life had reasserted themselves despite the violence that had preceded this peace. The confrontation 3 months ago had lasted less than an hour. Volkov had arrived at Stone's compound with 3 men, expecting to find a terrified family willing to negotiate for their lives. Instead, he'd found Isabella Santos waiting for him in the main hall, flanked by her daughter and husband, backed by 24 armed bikers who'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Emma could still remember the look of shock on Volkov's face when he realized she was alive. Still hear the way his voice had cracked when Isabella stepped forward and told him exactly what she thought of men who threatened children. The FBI had arrived 20 minutes later, following coordinates Stone had provided them, to find Volkov and his men contained but alive, a gift Isabella had insisted on, not out of mercy, but out of a desire to see justice served in courtrooms rather than violence. Now, stirring scrambled eggs while her parents shared coffee and quiet conversation at the kitchen table, Emma marveled at how seamlessly they'd reconstructed themselves as a family. There had been awkward moments, certainly. 12 years of separation couldn't be erased overnight. But there had also been grace in their reunion, a recognition that love had survived the lies that had once seemed necessary to preserve it. "Nervous?" Isabella asked, looking up from the newspaper she'd been reading aloud to David. Emma considered the question. Starting over at a new school at 13, carrying the weight of everything she'd learned about herself and her family, should have been terrifying. Instead, she felt something approaching excitement. For the first time in her life, she would be entering a classroom as exactly who she was, Emma Santos Rodriguez, daughter of a librarian and a woman who'd been brave enough to testify against killers. "Not nervous," she said, plating the eggs. "Just ready." David smiled at her response, understanding flickering in his eyes. "It's going to be different, having friends who know the whole truth about us." "Good different," Emma said firmly. She'd spent 12 years being careful about what she revealed, constantly editing her stories to protect the fiction of their quiet life. The prospect of authenticity, even ordinary teenage authenticity, felt like a gift she was still learning to unwrap. Isabella rose from the table, moving to stand behind Emma with the natural grace that had returned to her, once the constant fear had lifted. "Your father and I were talking yesterday about summer plans," she said, her hands settling on Emma's shoulders. "Stone mentioned something about teaching you to ride a motorcycle." Emma laughed, the sound carrying a lightness that would have been impossible months earlier. "Mom, I'm 13. "Which is exactly what I told him," Isabella replied, but her tone was amused rather than concerned. The relationships between their family and Stone's world had evolved into something none of them had expected. Not friendship exactly, but a deep mutual respect born from shared danger and the recognition that love took many forms. The school bus appeared at the end of their street, yellow and ordinary and magnificent in its normalcy. Emma gathered her backpack, accepting kisses from both parents with the comfortable embarrassment of any teenager heading off to face a new day. "Pick you up at 3?" David called from the doorway. "I'll walk home," Emma replied. "It's only 6 blocks." She saw the brief flicker of old fear cross her parents' faces, the instinctive need to maintain constant vigilance over her movements. But it passed quickly, replaced by the conscious choice to trust in the safety they'd fought so hard to secure. Walking toward the bus, Emma felt the morning sun warm on her face and allowed herself a moment of profound gratitude. Not just for the end of the danger that had shaped her entire existence, but for the family that had emerged from the wreckage of secrets and necessary lies. They were different people now than they'd been before, marked by what they'd survived, strengthened by what they'd chosen to face together. The bus doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and Emma climbed aboard, choosing a seat near the window. As they pulled away from the curb, she caught a glimpse of her parents standing together in the doorway, watching her leave with the careful attention of people who'd learned never to take ordinary moments for granted. For the first time in her life, Emma Santos Rodriguez was exactly who she appeared to be. The feeling was extraordinary,